Welcome to season 2 of the Mixtape with Scott. This is episode 3. We have a great interview today, but before I introduce our guest, we have to go through our liturgy about the role of stories in our lives. Please don't fall asleep in church as I say this. Each week, I'm going to read you a line from a great book by Sue Johnson entitled Hold Me Tight, 7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love, as it embodies what I'm about and what this show is about. We use stories to make sense of our lives, and we use stories as models to guide us in the future. We shape stories, and then stories shape us. The Mixtape with Scott is a podcast devoted to hearing the personal stories of economists, scientists, and authors. And as you listen with open hearts and open minds to these people's stories, my hope is that you will hear echoes of your own story, that you will feel a connection to the interviewees, and come away with a new story that helps you and me make sense of our lives and maybe even give us a model to help us navigate the future as well. So with that said, let me give you a warm introduction to one of my favorite economists around anywhere, Dr. Beatrice Cherrier. They don't make them like Beatrice anymore, literally, because she's a historian of economic thought, and over time that's sadly become a smaller and smaller part of contemporary economists' edification and their readings. And yet, if we were to believe Dr. Sue Johnson that I just said, we need the stories of economists and we need the story of economics in order to make sense of the field that we're in right now and to make sense of ourselves in that field and the other people that are in it. So I'm proud to call Beatrice a friend. I appreciated her willingness to be on the podcast. I wanted to thank her for that. And so this is season 2 of the Mixtape with Scott, and I'm your host, Scott Cunningham. Okay, well, this is a real pleasure to talk to someone that over the years I've gotten to really enjoy getting to know. Beatrice Cherrier. How do you pronounce your last name, Beatrice?
Cherrier.
Cherrier. Okay, Beatrice Cherrier. Beatrice, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Can you, for the sake of the listener, say your name and what your job title is and where you work right now?
Yes, so I'm Beatrice Cherrier. That's how you say in French. I'm a CNRS researcher. So the CNRS is the biggest research organization in France, covering all social science, hard science, and humanities. And I'm an associate professor at Polytechnique, which is one of France's foremost engineering school that have a long tradition of teaching and researching economics alongside engineering and physics.
Oh, okay. Which city are you in? Did you say Paris?
Sorry?
Did you say you were in Paris?
In the south of Paris. Yes.
South of Paris.
Well, in the Parisian area.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Is that like in the city or is that kind of outside?
No, it's interesting. They like in the past 30 years, France has tried to move most of its big schools outside of Paris itself. So Polytechnique is in the south of Paris on a big area of land called Plateau de Saclay, and basically they're trying to build a sort of technological cluster here. So they have a lot of higher school like Polytechnique, Télécom Paris, like agricultural schools. So there's a lot of research unit by large companies who are building headquarters here as well. So it's like south of Paris, big land, tons of building getting out of the land in the past years.
Oh, okay. Is it expensive where you're living?
I don't live nearby. Well, Paris area is always more expensive than in the countryside, but less than in Paris.
Oh, okay. Cool. So, so where did you grow up?
Sorry, the connection is not really good. Can you repeat?
Sorry, where did you grow up?
So I grew up a bit all over the place. My parents were moving a lot. I'm from Corsica, which is an island south of France, in between France and Italy, but we were like essentially moving around in France every 3 years. Basically, so south, north, east, west, every area.
Oh, okay. Okay. Did you have any siblings?
Oh yeah, I got two brothers and one sisters.
Oh, okay. Okay. What did your parents do for a living?
So my father is an engineer.
Huh.
Well, he's retired now, and my mother is a sculptor.
Oh,
So that's really it. But she stopped to raise her four kids for.
and you grew up, did you say that you grew up sort of in the countryside also around France, or did you say you grew up in the city?
Oh God, the connection is really really bad. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay.
Um, so I grew up I partly in the Paris area in Paris, partly in various part of the countryside in the south of France. So I'm more a countryside person. I did most of my career. I moved to Polytechnique 2 years ago,
Hmm.
and I most of my career in the countryside as well.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, so what were some of your favorite things to do as a family when you were little?
Um, well, I don't really know. I don't think I had huge preference.
Hmm.
For instance, I don't remember I was especially keen about history at that time. I mean,
Hmm.
maybe a bit of philosophy. I majored in physics in high school,
Mm.
uh, so experimental physics maybe. I was doing a lot of music. I don't. I mean, I think you could interest me in any topics already when I was a kid.
Okay.
So
Okay.
no sharp preference.
Did you have an early experience in high school where you were learned about economics?
And no, that's an interesting thing. So I take a single course in economics in high school, and then out of high school, I did this typically French classe préparatoire, which is sort of like high level training to go into grandes écoles, sort of top school. So you can go to university out of high school in France, but you can also go to this class préparatoire with a lot of course and a lot of training and a lot of exams, and then you go through national contests to enter either engineering school or business school or others, and
Yeah.
you're ranked at the national level. So I did that.
Yeah.
Again, I didn't do any economics. I did mostly math. And then when I enter École Normale Supérieure, I actually entered an economics department.
Huh.
So it means I took my first economic class at the senior level. I never had a single economics class before that time.
Mm.
So it felt kind of surprising.
Well, what was the class about?
So I entered economic École Normale Supérieure, and it was theoretically oriented department. They were specialized in decision theory, economics of uncertainty. So we
Oh,
went straight into a lot of economics of uncertainty.
that was your first
And
class? Your first class
yeah,
was
yeah,
economics of
exactly.
uncertainty? Wow.
Yeah. So, and just I just did not expect that.
Mm.
So the only thing I had in class préparatoire was some sort of recent economic history class, for instance, about the Asian crisis and the
Mm.
Latin American debt crisis. So very narrative. So it was about, I don't
Mm.
know, debt, exchange rate, banks. And then I
Right.
go to an economics department, and the first course is just like applied math.
Yeah.
And so Lagrangian and having a very mathematized consumer behavior and things like that. So I just felt it was to me it was even easier because I could actually the problem is that I could actually apply my math tool, get good grades
Mm.
without really understanding the economics content of that, which
Right.
only came a
Right.
lot later. And I think my dominant feeling was really surprised. I remember thinking, wow, there is really a gap between the way the public is discussing economics and what's going on in that class. And
Mm.
no one can explain to me that gap.
Mm.
That's interesting.
Mm. That's interesting. Did you like so what parts of the economics were you noticing for the first time when you were learning I mean, when
Uh,
you're taking a class like that and you're doing all those Lagrangians, you could literally not necessarily you might have difficulty seeing any of the actual economic content. But it sounds like you did see it. What was it that you saw?
No, I saw it later. So basically, at École Normale Supérieure in this time, you do sort of you start a master degree, and before you actually do your second year of master and specialize into doing a PhD, if you want, you basically go through a national teaching contest, which is called the agrégation. And so you prepare to become an economics teacher. That year, I remember the first mock exam we had at the beginning of the year. So it's like all style writing essays on the topic. And economics topic was something like, are we witnessing a change in the cycle? And I couldn't do the exam. And I went to see the director and said, I'm sorry, I don't know what a cycle is. And at that moment, I was like, okay, now I'm basically preparing to become an economics teacher. I'd better learn economics. And so I took a micro textbook and I took a macro textbook and I read them top to bottom.
Yeah.
But it was already the third year into doing economics. So I basically could go through almost a whole economics degree not knowing what a cycle is or monopolistic competition is or this kind of basic notion. So I learned about the economic content after.
Do you think it was always like that in economic history, where there was this awkwardness of learning the material? Because I actually think in America, what I notice is the difficulty of going from the undergraduate level training to the graduate level training is so massive. I mean, and it's always the math for America, at least that it seems like for Americans, it's always that math. But it sounds like you went the opposite. You had the math first and then the economics. Has education curriculum in the history of economics, has it ever been like something that has it changed a lot? I guess, is it different over time a lot?
I think it's different across times and across countries. So for instance, in France, so I would say, for instance, you can actually get a good sense of that if you read Marion Fourcade's book on economics and societies. So basically what she does is that she compares the US, the UK, and France across the 20th century in terms both of economic research and education. And there is also a very recent book by Keith Tribe that re-examined the history of economic education in the UK since the mid-19th centuries. And for instance, there are huge difference. In the UK, for instance, you would learn about the economics content like right away, like at Cambridge or Oxford. In France, you had two traditions, and you could still see that very late in the 20th century. There is one tradition whereby economics is attached to law schools, basically. I mean, like there were only economics department or economics curricula starting in the 70s, late 60s. So it's pretty late. So before that time, and you still have that sense, either you were learning economics or part of a law degree to some extent. And so it was very institutional, And so who is a consumer, who's firms, national accounting was
Lost you.
Which is in the engineering school. Economics has been since at least the 20s. And it was completely different. It was basically the application of math tools to, for instance, understand whether you actually want to have a tax to build a road or a bridge or something like that.
Yeah.
And it was a completely different tradition in economics. So in that case, you actually learn the math first.
Yeah.
Very early in the 20th century. And then sometimes in your career as an engineer, you're led to economics questions about taxation, about construction, about costs and benefits, about marginal costs and things like that. And so you take your math tools and you apply them to economics issue. And so I guess a lot of French economic researcher going to top school in the US are actually coming from that tradition, learning math. And then fairly late in their curriculum, Tirol, for instance, that's what it did. It went through polytechnics. I think if you listen to him closely, he would say that while in Polytechnique, he had no interest in economics at all. And quite late in his studies, it was like, oh, you can actually do some analysis of competition with these tools and when to apply these tools to economics question. So that's not the only French experience you can have with economics. A lot of other, for instance, the regulation school, Orléans Boyer is an excellent analysis of the banking system and the financial systems and notions of crisis that is very institutionalist and in character. And then there is that other tradition of taking math tools and applying them to economics issues. You can see these two traditions in French and French economics.
So Piketty, Thomas Piketty, he probably got that math first, econ second kind of training.
I don't remember.
I
don't remember his training. I know he did a PhD with Grandmont, and Grandmont was also a polytechnicien and trained in math before he actually got trained in economics. Yes.
So when you decided that you wanted to become an economist, was there, in your path to becoming an economist, what was sort of the first intellectual experience that really meant a lot to you, that was like, that was sort of an early, I love this, this is what I love. It's had a bit, this is intellectually so deep and interesting. What would it have been?
So I remember several episodes. So first I make my choice negatively. So basically I was basically, when I was in class préparatoire, I was rather set to enter a business school. And I was like, I don't want to do this career.
Right.
So I trying to find a place to land that was not it. And so that's how I landed at the École Normale Supérieure in an economics department. And so then I really proceeded that I knew what I didn't want to do. When you are at École Normale Supérieure, you also start teaching very early at age 19 or 20, basically, since you have to go through that teaching contest at some point. And even if you become a researcher, you have to teach basically at 19 and 20. In the first year when you arrive, you have to teach one class. So basically you have the age of the students. And I do remember teaching my first economics class at 19, and it was on money, and I get out. It's really, at 19, you're not in the mood for becoming a teacher. I mean, you just out of high school, there's no way you're gonna want to have the life of your teacher. But I do remember I taught that class, and when I get out, I was like, I know how to do that. I can teach well. Really, it was very clear. It was like I did not know if I wanted to do that, but I knew I could explain these things. I knew I could tell stories to the students.
Oh, so wait, so one of your first experiences making you want to become an economist is actually just teaching and explaining, because in France, they've got you teaching economics very early. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one thing.
And you didn't know the material, so you're having to learn it.
Oh no, I had to. As I was saying, I was mostly doing applied math. So if I wanted each money to first year to it was to freshmen basically. Right. I basically have to learn about notions of money and change in how economics conceive money just the day before, essentially. So
oh my gosh,
been like that. So that was a first. That certainly was a first experience. Then let me think about it. I had a second negative experience. So before my last year at École Normale Supérieure, which was about choosing a second year of master before specializing for a PhD, I took a year off and I went to work at the French Central Bank. So I did consumption forecasting and stuff like that. And I do really, so it was exactly the kind of career you could have as an economist. And I also made a negative choice. I do remember I had some epistemological questions that no one could answer. Like I was supposed to do models to predict consumption in the next quarter. And I was like, I don't think that's possible at all. It's really weird. So I was doing VARs. Basically, so as to sort of, or anything that was about signal extraction at that time, like spectral analysis was very fashionable, I remember. And I remember attending a conference with other central bank economists, and the speaker was a famous statistician in France, Alain Montfort, and it was basically making fun of the audience for not understanding essential stuff about the statistical tools we were using. So he would say, for instance, you're using spectral analysis or filtering theory mindlessly, and so you're generating spurious correlation in the data, and you're not even aware of that. You have to be more careful about your tools. And
you were saying this, or somebody else was saying this?
It was Alain Montfort, the statistician, was saying that to the audience of central banking economists, saying you're not careful enough.
This is like a Lucas critique kind of thing he's saying.
Yes, it was more, so it was less epistemology deep. It was people were building a new macroeconometric model for France, and it was more pragmatic. Yes, the way you use your tool, you have to get a deeper understanding of what to do, what not to do. And I really felt okay, I cannot do that job, because to some extent, if I do that, I'll be a button pusher. So a button pusher. Well, I can use a software, I can get some R2 out of my software, but I never got that very deep understanding of the statistical tools that I'm using.
Yeah.
And I can see that I would need it. Right. I was trained as a rational decision theorist. So I didn't have that sort of core understanding on how I was using statistical tool that I felt I needed.
Where did you get the rational decision making? Is that because of that early class on uncertainty?
We had sort of decision and their uncertainty theory 1, 2, 3. I mean,
wow,
a lot of training in that. That's because
really,
that's because the researcher here are still really good at decision theory. So I also learned growth theory and how to apply these models in Stata. And
how old are you at this point? How old are you?
It was a year. I took a year off from my curriculum at the École Normale Supérieure to work at the central bank, and that's where I understood that clearly I was not going to become an econometrician. I mean, I didn't have the necessary depth to do that.
Because you always were wanting to go deeper. I mean, like, there's a story where there's a person in your shoes who would have been perfectly content to continue to just do the work and not be particularly bothered by not having these epistemological questions answered. But you're not like that, right? Is that
I don't think so. I mean, the central bank modelers that I know, and I know a lot of them, some of them are my friends, and I also wrote histories on economics analysis at the Bank of England and at the Fed, so I do talk a lot to central bank economists, and they do have a huge epistemological depth about what are their tools, what their tools are going to deliver, and can you actually use the ESG models in a central banks? What plugs in do you actually need? What knowledge of data do you actually need? What knowledge of institution do you need? I found them, I just felt I didn't have that epistemological depth, and at the same time, so something I didn't mention is that at the same time I was doing that economics education, I was also attending course at the divinity school, and it was one where a famous French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who is one of the leading hermeneutics and phenomenology philosopher, was still teaching there. And so I did I took a lot of course in philosophy of hermeneutics,
but it was in the divinity school.
Yeah, totally unrelated. It was
totally were you sort of thinking of two different possible tracks, or you just had two different interests?
No, well, I had different interests. There were a moment I did realize that I was supposed to become an economics, and yet I knew very little about economics.
Yeah.
So it did not feel very comfortable. So I just did a very different curriculum on the side.
Got it.
Learning Greeks and Hebrew, and and also doing a lot of philosophy because of the impact of that that very famous philosopher
Yeah.
on that school.
What
And
was
so
that, because you have a religious background, or was it more of just like a historical, philosophical kind of
I
sensibility?
I happen to have a religious background, but it's sort of Lutheran theology, and most of the people were not here for religious reason. It's just like doing a degree in humanities, essentially.
Got it. Okay.
Like
Got it.
understanding religion, but I mean the phenomenon of religion
Yeah.
itself, not deepening your own. If you want to deepen your own faith,
Right.
don't be a
I get
divinity.
it. I get it. Yeah.
So I didn't rationalize it that way, but it was sort of humanities, like ancient history and a lot of philosophy training at that time. So at the same time, I was like, I'm not going to be an econometrician. I'm not deep in. I clearly sense I was not deep enough. And on the other hand, I had that questions of why economics is the way it is. You know, that book I had, and I felt I had the tools to actually answer that kind of questions. And I wanted to actually discuss with the historian of economics who would become my supervisor, and he had time to give me and then give me stuff to read. And slowly I was like, yeah, I think I can. I was very, to me, for instance, asking questions about values and worldviews and positive and normative analysis, to me, it felt natural.
Right.
And so when I came back to having to choose a master specialty, I choose philosophy of economics. I was
Is
still
philosophy of economics different from history of economic thought?
No, I was not yet into.
What's philosophy of economics?
Well, philosophy of economics is to actually understand questions of ontology. So ontology is really what's essentially an economic phenomenon, and epistemology. How do you know? How do economists know? Do criteria to know economic phenomena change over time?
Right.
How do they feel they know well or know bad things and whatever? So that's the kind of things you study Kuhn, for instance, and Petosh and that kind of stuff. So I was doing that, and I still was not really satisfied with that, because it felt really, that's not what it is. But I was young, and I felt like I was like an armchair philosopher, just taking economic theories or economic practice and giving my own little informed opinion about them.
Yeah.
And what happened is that my master thesis was about positive and normative analysis in the research of Gunnar Myrdal.
Oh, yeah, the Nobel Prize winner that wins it with Hayek. Okay.
And so I went, actually, what I did at some point, so I researched his changing views of the positive and normative elements in economic theory.
Is that what he's mostly known for?
No, so he's known for very different things. That's what is interesting. So he's known for the theory of the monetary economics he did in the 30s.
Yeah.
But then by economic standard, it changes interest enough to become more of a sociologist. That's what economists would say. That's not what he would say. And I guess is most famous for something called American Dilemma, and looking into the root economic and sociological cause of discrimination against Black.
He writes that? I did know that.
He wrote that during the war.
What year is that?
He published it in 1944. So he did the research during the war. World War II, basically. And it's a very famous, not in economics, but in humanities. It's one of the first actual research that attributes difference in outcomes between white and Black Americans, not to genetics, but to economics discrimination or economics path and things like that.
But it did not. It did, with Becker's discrimination work that comes in the 50s. It just never had the impact in economics the way like Becker's work would have an impact.
No, because it was very institutionalist.
Yeah.
With sort of backward loop. So it's all literally style. There is no models in there.
No models.
By the way, it's not because he was not capable of doing that. That's what he had done in the 20s and 30s, is really providing models of money and monetary economics and models of the interest rate. But the style he chose to do American Dilemma was really a big institutional research into the US constitutions and accumulating data on economics outcomes from. So it was not that style of work.
Yeah.
Also, at that time, it was more working in public and international institutions. So I'm not even sure I actually tried to make a difference in academia. It was not teaching in academia anymore.
It's almost like a de Tocqueville kind of effort.
Uh,
Alexis de Tocqueville, like just coming to the United States and writing from France a book on this kind of comparative French.
Oh, yes.
It's almost kind of got that feel to it.
Yes.
Who's the audience for that book? Is it sociologists?
I don't think he thought of so it was commissioned work. So he had a lot more impact in sociology than in economics.
But that's not what you write your thesis on. What do you write? You write it on normative.
I actually studied his different phase.
Yeah.
And try to understand. So and what he does basically in the first period of his life, he's actually very much of a positivist. He even wrote a book called The Political Element in the Development of Economics.
Yeah.
Saying, okay, in welfare analysis, you have positive analysis and normative economics. You should be able to disentangle.
Yeah.
What is interesting is that he wrote the last chapter on a visit in the US during the 29 crisis. And so the last chapter is already different. It has that sense that maybe you cannot fully separate your positive and normative analysis in the end. And then he shifted in the 30s and 40s while writing American Dilemma to a completely different epistemology, saying, okay, working with values is basically unavoidable. What you can avoid is smuggling your own values as a researcher into the analysis. And you can do that by adopting the values of the actually public that you study. For instance, for him, it was the value in the US Constitution, and making them explicit. So it's a strong shift in how to handle values in economic analysis. So that's what I studied. And when I did that, at some point, I decided to go to the archives, to visit his archives, to understand
How old are you? How old are you when you're doing this?
I'm in a master, so I'm probably sort of 21, I think.
Wow.
22. I don't remember.
Wait, are you at his? Are you at his university? Are you at his university, or was it you had to go to?
Yes, I'm. It's at the moment I decide I'm gonna do a PhD in that. And when I do, that's really to me it was a big experience, because when I opened the archive, there were tons of, so his wife, Alva Myrdal, he's also a Nobel Prize. She got the Nobel Prize for Peace because she from disarmament.
Oh,
and she by that early.
Who got it first? She got it first.
No, he got it first. It was the second one with Hayek.
Yeah,
which is pretty much a big history. So he got it in like 74, 75, and she got it in the 80s.
She got it in the 80s.
Yes.
Oh.
But it's an interesting couple. And so I went to the archive, found letters between them and with all sorts of colleagues. And also when he was working on American Dilemma, between the colleagues in the US, in sociology, for instance, and his work. And I was really like, okay, that's data. So it's not me sitting in my chair and giving my informed opinion about this research. This is really me reconstructing how a body of work came to be from data.
Yeah.
And so I decided I would do that. I would specialize in history of economics, and I would work from data, which is at that time that was archive.
That was on the master's thesis. So with that master's thesis and being in the archives in particular, it felt very empirical. There, it was a very as opposed to as opposed to that more purely mathematical work, which didn't feel it wasn't empirical or something.
No, as opposed to at that, again, I think this is a wrong view of philosophy of economics, but at that time, my feeling was that, so I did my PhD comparing the ties between values and theories in Myrdal compared with Milton Friedman, compared with Jacob Marshak, who is the founding director of the Coles Commission.
Oh, goodness.
And in all three cases, I did archive research. And I felt that it was a different process than reading their work and trying to assess the internal consistency of their work. For instance, a philosopher would ask, is Friedman doing what he says is doing in terms of handling data? For instance, is it more of an inductivist researcher, of a deductivist researcher? Did his practice change across time? Is it consistent with what he's saying? Is it internally consistent with scientific standards? And that's not the question I ended up asking. My question were more, how did they came to develop the theories that they developed? Where did they found their data? Were they influenced by the times they're writing in, by their encounters, by their wives, and so forth?
One's more like critical judgment and one's more like sociological or personal.
Well, one is more about thinking about context and the consistency of conceptual analysis, and the other one is just trying to reconstruct a process on the basis of data.
Yeah.
Which are archived, for instance. So
that was your dissertation in graduate school, or that was your master's thesis?
No, Myrdal was my master's thesis, and then I actually did more work on Myrdal. Also work on Friedman, and also work on Marshak, because they were contemporaries, and I wanted to do some comparative analysis.
Did they like each other?
They didn't know each other, really.
They didn't even know each other.
I just picked them because they went through World War II. All three of them, they were actually working at around the same time, but from different background with different type of work. And I wanted to compare all the three of them.
So Friedman and Myrdal never really interacted?
No.
Did Hayek and Myrdal interact?
Oh, yes. Friedman and Hayek. I mean, they're not even from the same generation, but there are famous stories in how they interacted, for instance, at the Mount Pelerin Society. Though, I mean,
Myrdal was in the Mount Pelerin Society?
No. I was thinking Hayek and Friedman.
Oh, no. I was saying Hayek and Myrdal.
They actually, Myrdal knew about Hayek's very early work that was in economic theory, but I mean, Myrdal, after American Dilemma, so we are in 44, he got to the United Nations, and then he got into doing some development economics in international organizations. So he was really doing something completely different. Yeah,
but didn't he have a negative reaction to having to share the Nobel Prize with Hayek? Thought I heard it.
Yes, privately it was like, privately it was saying, okay, we don't share the same politics, we don't share the same epistemology, we don't do the same type of work. This really doesn't make sense. He even thought about refusing the Nobel Prize on ground of sharing with Hayek, and in the end,
he had a negative opinion of Hayek.
Well, at that point, he probably have a negative political opinion of Hayek. So, but it's just happened because of the Nobel Prize. They didn't have the same career. They didn't have real interactions. That's just.
So you do that work. You go to graduate school, and where do you end up going to get your PhD? Is it a PhD or is it called something different?
No, it's a PhD. It's a PhD in economics.
PhD in economics.
And the field is history of economics.
History of economics. Where do you end up going?
For a PhD, I had to shift university. I first go to La Sorbonne, and then my PhD advisor moved to Nanterre, and so I followed him there. And so I finished my PhD in Nanterre.
Did I have some memory that you worked with Thomas Piketty, or almost did, or something like that? Is that right?
I didn't.
You didn't. Okay. So how was that? I know you haven't been in American PhD programs, but I know you probably know everything about them. So how is the experience like in France for the PhD training in economics versus what's like a typical training in the United States?
So I did my PhD in the 2000. And at that time, I think, especially in history of economics, but in economics more generally, it was fairly loose. You didn't have a lot of training once you entered the PhD program. And my reason for choosing my PhD advisor was that because I stopped and took a year off, most of my fellow students I saw going into the PhD program 1 year ahead of me, and they really seemed all left how do you say in English?
Left to their devices or something like that.
Left to their own. I mean,
Yeah.
they were seeing their PG advisors like every 3 months for an hour. I mean, they really had no idea what they were doing. So I was like, maybe I should choose the advisor rather than the topic and choose
Mm,
someone that is actually going to help me. Because at that time, it was just the. So I think France was lagging the US. And in all countries in the past 20 years, we make progress into really training PhD students, like through summer schools, or in France, for instance, you didn't have any courses in the first year of the PhD program. You actually picked up book and learned how to be a historian, and I think even an econometrician or labor economics by talking to people.
really?
Now it's more systematized. So I felt it was really loose, basically. Hopefully,
Mm,
we were a group of PhD students, so we were trading nice reads and trying to emulate. Basically, it was about emulating a nice paper and whatsoever. Now, if you actually train into becoming, of course, any field, but even history of economics, you're gonna get serious methodological courses into how to do archive or how to do quantitative work, how to do
yeah.
text analysis, how to do network analysis, how to read
Mm,
text, and but it didn't exist even 15 years
sure.
at that time.
Right. Because it seems like, the kinds of work, if you're working with literary texts or things like that, citation counts, learning, natural language processing and network analysis to understand connections between people, especially the way that you described your work, that does sound like that would be very, very important.
Yeah, so basically the way we did is, so you ask what the methods you're going to use are going to depend on the question you ask. For instance, if I ask question about how did Bob Lucas came up with our models with rational expectation, I'll have to go to the archive to understand how he came up with the idea, who he was influenced with. It was at Carnegie, so was he influenced by Bellman, or who actually
Mm,
taught in Bellman and stuff like that. But then if I want to study dissemination, and for instance, another question which is, how did that rational expectation models became popular? And
yeah.
how did it spread throughout the profession? Then what I have to do is to do network analysis and bibliometrics to
Mm,
actually track the spread of that kind of models and
mm.
who actually supervise whom, who actually where the paper
You're
published.
in the archive. What documents are you going towards to get advisor advisee? You're
Oh,
going,
I got a colleague who actually did that completely systematically. So Andrzej Forensic is doing a prosopography, which is a word that actually means collective quantitative biography of
yeah,
economics as a whole.
yeah.
So it really depends. Sometimes, and I did some prosopography of Stanford when I work on history of economics at Stanford,
Mm-hmm.
Minnesota as well. That's interesting for me, and MIT when I did my postdoc on the history of economics at MIT. So sometimes secretaries do keep a very detailed record of who graduating when, who was on the committee, what was the topic, and stuff like that. And sometimes you have to go through the archive, like for instance, Solo's archive, and look into all the dissertation is supervised, and you look at the or you go to university record and look at the printed PhDs and try to decipher the signatures to understand who was on the committee. And sometimes
Oh,
it can be
wow.
really long. So
Wow.
it's really detective work. So you actually take a pictures of the first pages of like every dissertation in economics you can find, and for instance, the MIT library or the
Mhm.
Stanford library, and you're like, okay, I think this is like Gen A
What
or
about those optic scanners? What about that? The scanners that are like kind of able to quickly read, signatures and extract that. Are you using any of that kind of technology?
we're starting to use them, but
Starting to
that's
use them?
yeah, but it's just like machine learning. You have to have a database to
Right.
train your
Yeah,
stuff
yeah,
on,
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and we're the first to do that. So yeah, you
Right.
actually have to build your own database of
Right.
scenarios to begin with. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. So you what do you write your dissertation on again? What is it?
So I wrote my dissertation on the links between theories and values.
Theories and values.
And then I compared three economists from the same generation doing very different work. So
And
near,
that was Myrtle, Friedman, and Moshnick.
yes, exactly.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Um,
Well, so Friedman's the one I know the most about. What could you tell me about him that what could you tell
so
me
what
about?
I can tell you is that when you actually, so he's one of the most interesting character to think about these issues because he's as well known from his for his monetary theory and monetary history and monetary empirics as for his commitment, not even commitment to for building the basics of neoliberalism, like free to choose, capitalism and freedom, and so forth. And
Mm-hmm.
so you have a question, and the question is, like lots of people are going to say, "Oh, that shows that Friedman is ideological." And my question is, how do you show that?
Mm-hmm.
How do you show that? There, you get a chicken and egg problem.
Mm-hmm.
Did the science come first? Of course, it's going to tell you not intervening in market as both efficient. So that's the science. And
Mm-hmm.
it's also fair, because there is a tyranny of the majority. And so markets are better, fairer way to actually connect decisions of individual to one another than other types of political processes.
Mm-hmm.
So you get that, and he would say in his own words, my science and my politics happen to be consistent. They leads to the kind of same policy advice, like don't touch the markets too much, and it's a lucky consistency. And that's his own word, lucky consistency
A
of my.
lucky consistency.
And the whole question is, how do you analyze that? If you're trying to see if the science or the ideology comes first, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah. It's all endogenous. It's all just
exactly. So
humans learning things.
what I did is try to basically rebuild the development of his worldview. So in a
Yeah.
worldview, you actually both have the epistemological commitments
Yeah.
and the political commitments. And
Yeah.
I tracked into the archive whom he talked to, who he was influenced by, and by his wife, for instance, but by
Mm.
his brother-in-law, Aaron Director,
Aaron
by
director.
his own experience, his war work. So he basically
Mm.
worked on price control during the war,
Mm.
and he actually got some ideas about how problematic it can be from all this. So you sort of avoid the egg and chicken problem of saying this is scientific and this is not scientific. This is
Mm.
not. You're not going to get a lot out of that. Basically, I
What's
think
his worldview then?
so. His worldview is it developed at the same time. This kind of efficiency and fairness issue developed at the same time. The idea that how market works and how markets are basically a way to solve disagreement among citizens.
Mm.
And you in that you can both build. So he actually worked with Savage
Mm.
uh,
Yeah, right. He's got
in the
that
paper,
paper.
and
Right.
he got Savage view of kind of subjective probabilities in how
Mm.
to make people's subjective probability converge. How does this work? And then it sort of apply that both to economics and to a political system.
Mm.
And that's also in that very early period that it came to the idea that the Great Depression was actually caused by central banks and how they failed to issue enough money in the economy, and then is set to actually build monetary series with Anna Schwartz to actually test that hypothesis. But you can see in the archive that when he started that work with Anna Schwartz, he already had that notion of what caused the Great Depression that was here. And so then he went through 20 years of empirical work to actually make sense of that hypothesis. He also was an excellent statistician, but he did not believe that statistical testing alone could actually prove an hypothesis.
Mm.
He thought that you need to have a full history, a full economic history of crisis to actually get to a conclusion.
Yeah, yeah. Is that Is there something about what you just said that could help explain why he talks to Pinochet?
Um, okay, so that's a
That
political.
markets are ways of, helping people that are at odds with each other. This is a dictator. He's oppressive and hostile to his people. I mean, is there something in that makes him think?
So I don't know enough. If you wanna solve that stories, there are really detailed histories of who we talked to exactly. Was it Pinochet? What's his concepts of advising, for instance? I would say that it went there for a short period, that it was asked to do something specific that was about the implementation of ideas. So you would need to talk to a specialist of that.
Okay.
That's heated issues. So I can tell you, if I wanted to answer your question, I'll need to go back and check into that literature, for instance, by Leonidas Montes, who got a prize for a paper on Friedman in Chile, for instance. Who was he talking to? What was he asked to do?
Mm-hmm.
What did he understand about Pinochet's program at that time, and how it was later reconstructed? You have to be specific about uh, what it was asked to do, whether
So
it had.
your work, the way you approach this is you don't just sit and like live in the ideas. You're following them, you're following their conversations and your
Yes,
research.
yes, exactly. So typically, I'm going to go to the archive. I'm going to check correspondence, of course.
Mm,
For another good type of data to think about their intellectual development is grant applications as
mm,
well, because there's that big issue. If you follow ID through textbooks and how they're being taught, they all seem clear and obvious, because a good textbook writer is someone that's going to make you, like, they'll tell you about economic theories or economic practice, about statistical practice, about econometrics, and it's going to sound obvious,
yeah.
like stripping all the process to its bare essential and get you the core intuition, and as a student you're going to walk away with that.
Yeah.
What I do is the exact opposite of that. I mean,
Mm,
ideas don't come obvious. It's messy. There's a lot of failures. You don't get to, and it's not about economists waking up one day and saying, "Oh, I'm going to reconstruct monetary theories up to the I get an understanding on whether central banks put enough money in the economy when there was a credit crunch or whatever."
yeah.
Or in stuff that are of interest to you, whether some economists or econometrician, microeconometrician, show up in the 70s saying, "Oh, we have to find better ways of randomizing and come up with better theories of randomization." That's not
Mhm.
like that. I mean, that's not like that. People go to the government and the government says, "What you're doing here is not clear to us." You say there are omitted variables, but what is omitted variables and how do we solve them? And then you struggle and you actually write a grant application to actually try. So you develop a sort of research program, and then the research program is going to turn out differently, and maybe 30 years after you come to that understanding of what you've been trying to do over a period of 30 years.
Yeah.
And I think economists need more of that, and especially graduate students. You're not going to help graduate students by teaching them like well-packaged, very clear ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm reconstructing thinking or practicing economics in the middle of a mess, basically.
Right. Right. Right.
Trying
There was this comment made on Twitter. I'm sure you saw it, where the person said, this is paraphrase, we don't need to read historical writers because their value, if there is any, has already been incorporated into our modern training. That's like a summary. It was kind of more funny the way he said it, and it started this whole like viral deal. But and people, and so I was kind of curious what your response is to that, because on the face of it, putting aside that that's offensive to historians, there's a lot of things about it that are kind of useful, which is it seems like an efficient way to learn. Why would you read something twice when you could just read it once? And I was just wondering, that comment, what's your reaction to that comment? Why would a person in general do you think say that? And what do you think about that comment in general?
So two things. So even if it was true, and the notion that bad ideas are always dismissed and good ideas are like, if it was true that economics was a fully progressive science,
You're
which
right.
I guess after, I hope I just made the case to say uh, people think in context, and then ideas travel from, or tools travel from one context to another.
Right.
And if you want to train economists, you want to teach them the context in which these ideas emerge and who they
Mhm.
were talking to. I mean, it sort of matters that our Dubru were doing sort of mathematical economics at a moment when mathematics itself was very different from what it's now.
Mm.
So what they took and which mathematician they were talking to. And today math is different. Same with the like insight taken from psychology in economics. Psychology in the 50s is not like psychology in the 2000s.
Right.
And so you still need a good grasp on how sort of ideas got out of the messiness and the messiness in one period. And then if these ideas are sort of concepts or practice or resistance through changing times, how come? How they're repackaged, how they travel, and stuff like that. So that's one thing. I think you still need to actually to read all history, even very old, like Adam Smith.
Yeah.
When you actually read Adam Smith, it sounds very different from the package Adam Smith you heard of in Econ 101 or even
Right.
in graduate students.
Yeah.
And then there is that problem of that kind of statement assume a notion of progress whereby economics would still be much like physics. There are distant theories and you keep moving. What is weird is that I think that in the wake of the great financial crisis, economist epistemology shifted a bit. It shifted from that ideas that you have laws to be uncovered and right ones and wrong ones got dismissed, to a more pragmatic epistemology. You can see it in, for instance, Roderick economics rules. So the new epistemology economics seems to work from is basically something that you have a shelf of models and you're going to pick up some models for a specific purpose. And depending on what your purpose is, the economic models that make sense is quite different.
Yeah.
If that's your vision of economics, then you don't have that notion of, good ideas get incorporated whatsoever.
Mm.
You need to have a bookshelf of models or a bookshelf of intuition or a toolbox. And you need to understand what one to pick up at one time. And usually the people who create a sort of core model like Dixit-Stiglitz model, or a core tool like, for instance, synthetic control or instrumental variables,
Yeah.
when you read their text, it comes with a lot of, you can use this in that setting and not in that setting, and you want to be careful, and this doesn't generalize over that. And for instance, when computers are going to get better, you may want to do it differently. For instance, in the history of rational expectations, you can see actually Lucas saying, okay, we're going to do that models because that's what the computer allow us to do.
Right.
In 20 years, maybe the right models is going to be very different.
Right.
And
Right.
aware of that. and if you actually work from that sort of bookshelf epistemology of models,
Yeah.
it's even more interesting and even more useful to actually understand how these tools are created and how these models are created,
Mm-hmm.
what sets of caveats they come with, so you can shelve the whole package.
Mm.
I don't know if that's clear, but
Oh, it's great. That's so we're at the kind of the top of the hour, and I wanted to kind of wrap things up. So is there when you look back over your life, and you think about a paper in economics or a book in economics that you wouldn't necessarily say it's the most important paper you've ever read or the most important book, but it's a paper that you appear to have been influenced by. So like, for me, it's probably Spence's job market paper, his signaling paper, only because I just find that paper, I just now use it every day in the most casual way. It's just kind of like, it's just now shaped my brain a lot. But I wouldn't say that, it's the most important article ever written. It's just, it just lives in my head all the time. Do you have something like that you can think of?
Um, so like every person you actually had the question to, I would say I cannot pick up one,
Yeah.
probably because my interests change, and I like reading new work in history of economics. So I do have sort of like the 3 or 4 new papers and book that sort of affect me a lot every year.
Yeah.
So I got a series of them. So there are some that, so I was trained as a historian of science, and since it was new at the time to do history of economics as history of science, we looked for uh, good text in other parts of history of science. So I can say, for instance, Lauren Daston, who is a famous historian of science, wrote a book on how notions of objectivity in science came to change from the 19th century, saying, in the 19th century, it was balance and personal balance in the researcher mind. That was objectivity. While in the 20th century, and especially after World War II, it was more technical objectivity. I mean, the tools you use are going to give you that objectivity. Quantification is going to give you some objectivity. There is that book. In history of physics, there is a cool book by historians of physics David Kaiser, which is called How the Hippies Saved Physics, and that relates the rise of quantum theory to hippies in physics hippies in California actually taking drugs, getting high, thinking about the meaning of life and the meaning of religion, and relating that to deep epistemological issues about quantum theory.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right? And then in one book that I go around a lot is not by a historian, it's by a journalist named David Warsh, who wrote a book called Knowledge in the Wealth of I think it's Knowledge in the Wealth of Nations. And it's a history of how Paul Romer came up with a theory of endogenous theory, but in fact, it's a much larger history of how economists thought about growth since Adam Smith. Basically.
Oh, wow.
And it goes pretty deeply into notions of growth and what it means to actually try to solve the math with non-convexities and stuff like that. So pretty into technical issues, but also huge on context and what it means to present a new idea at the annual meeting of the American Economic Association, and how you get pushback and how it is spread in the profession, and the fear that is like trying to get your ideas through and whatever. It also influenced me quite a lot.
Those sound wonderful. Right now we're trying to be a more open and accepting profession, especially in the seminar culture. But the seminar culture has historically been a important part of the transmission of ideas and the sharpening of ideas, and it's just been this sociological mechanism. I mean, what's your overall feeling about that effort, when it's not really being driven by it's being driven by equity as opposed to sharpening the scientific purpose of it?
So I actually wrote a whole paper on that. I mean, the history of workshops in economics, workshops and conference in economics. And so I think there are very distinct subcultures. So Chicago actually sort of evolved a culture of if you want to sharpen your ideas, just go through fightings and clashes and calling things out and debunking where the corpses are buried and stuff like that. But there are really other cultures of arguing with each other, for sure. And also what you can see in the history of workshops and conferences is that it both reflected and contributed to build that sort of hierarchical structure that you can find in every science, but it is really stronger in economics than in other science. And so there is a premium to making a sort of smart comments rather than sort of helping the speaker. And at some point, you can even see, for instance, at LSE, that the people who are sitting in the front versus the people who are sitting in the back is different. So there is a whole big culture of that. Who do you invite? Who do you go to lunch with? That's also part of the workshop culture. And so, again, if you want to change that, I mean, it really helps to do the work that groups of economists have been doing on what kind of question female versus male get, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
how much they are interrupted and whatever. So this gives you a sense of the what, and saying, okay, so female gets interrupted like 20% more than male, and so there's a difference. But it doesn't give you any hints on the why and the how. And to do that, you need to do some histories of how the workshop culture and the debating culture evolved at Chicago and why it spread to other places. What were the alternative? For instance, at Harvard, you get the sort of more collective ways of organizing your workshop. For instance, it could be sharp, like in economic history at Harvard, for instance, but it would be different. So if you both want to understand what that culture comes from and what were the other culture that you can develop in a workshop, you need some history at some point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're not gonna the data you get on difference in treatment
Yeah.
are gonna help you see that that's the culture, but in themselves they're not gonna help you change the culture.
Right. Right.
That's the problem.
Right. Oh, Beatrice, this is so much fun to talk to you. I hope that we can keep doing this. This is really nice. I have just love learning from you. Um, I guess that's the conclusion for this week, but I really appreciate you giving me your time.
Thank you very much.